Hey y'all, Zach McDonald, your real estate agent with Real Property Associates, and this is my Seattle housing market watch for April 23rd, 2025. Well, before we jump into this week's update, I wanted to celebrate something with you all. According to YouTube, it's the 9-year birthday of my channel this week. So I wanted to thank all of you who have contributed and supported me over these past 9 years, and to many of you who have reached out and worked with me to purchase or sell a house. I wanted to say thank you. I appreciate you very much. And as I reflect back on 9 years, I still remember filming with my cell phone, standing outside or having somebody hold it. No microphones, no nothing. And so I think we've come a long way since then, and the hopefully information is better quality content as well. So I'll continue to make these videos and make content for you, and hopefully it is still helpful in the world today. Now, as we look at the real estate market, it's always evolving, right? It's been changing. Real estate in general has changed a lot over the last 9 years, especially in the technology realm. But something that's still important is the market dynamics. And so that's why I started talking about the market 9 years ago. There was nobody else talking about it on a regular basis. I think there's some other channels now where people are talking about the housing market more consistently here in the Seattle area. But I remember 9 years ago getting started, there were a lot of videos that were 5, 6 years old. Nobody else was making content. I started making these videos and seeing people following the channel. And at one point it would be like, you look for Seattle real estate, it was only my videos showing up, which was weird at the time. It was exciting and cool too. But I love that there's more people making content. I love that there's more voices in the Seattle real estate market and in other markets around the country. I think it's important for people that are looking for this information to be able to find it. So I love how many more people are embracing technology, making content, specifically in the real estate space. I started with monthly updates. We've added in these weekly updates here. And today I want to look at the last week, the sales in King and Snohomish County, the greater Seattle area, specifically residential sales. We'll talk about mortgage rates a little bit, and then also talk about how the market's been moving over the last week as far as the pending sales data is concerned. So let's start with the general market watch that we look at here each week. So if we look at the new listings coming on the market, we're seeing a slight downturn from what we did last week. So 733 over the past week versus 781 last week. We are seeing slightly more new listings though than we did last year. So today I want to look at last year a little bit and highlight some of the differences. We don't always do that every week, but I did want to touch on last year a little bit today. If we look at the list price reductions, I think this is huge because this is one of those signals that, hey, things are slowing down a little bit, or at least in some way, they're starting to slow down. 411 price reductions. That's a lot this week. And there were 316 last week. So, right, we're seeing 733 new listings. 410 of the listings maybe from the week before or 2 weeks or 3 weeks before are seeing price reductions. And last year, we saw 193 price reductions in the same week. So that's a massive difference in price reductions. And if you don't remember, you can, of course, go look at the video from last year. But I would say, to save you the time, the market was hot then last year. And it wasn't that much different, but I would say it was a little bit more competitive last spring. And we saw more pending sales last year, 815 pending sales in the same week as we had this year. So 775 this week. Last week, 742. So still seeing good sales activity, but last year a little bit more so. And sold listings too, 634 last year, 598 this week, but 477 the week before. And we're nearing the end of the month. So this next update next week should be considerably more, or at least more than where we're at right now as we wrap up the month. And looking at interest rates, I think the year over year comparison is kind of fun as well. Month over month, we're kind of in that same range that we've been in. Week over week, 694 average rates here on Mortgage News Daily survey, and that's what we follow along with. Last week, 692, so pretty much the same as last week, below 7, again, which is nice. Last year, 7.38% mortgage rates on the same update. So we're seeing rates down from the previous year, and interestingly, still market not quite as hot as last year. Part of it, I think we've got more listings on the market than we did last year. I think the other piece is there's more uncertainty again about, are interest rates coming down? When are they coming down? We've been in this environment now a few years, and I would say I was hopeful. A lot of people were hopeful that we would be seeing rates coming down already. And here we are still a few years later, 2.5, almost 3 years now, from when rates were relatively low. They'd been creeping up, but still around that 4%-ish mark. We're seeing, the housing market being resilient in a sense, but we're not seeing any of that explosive growth that we saw in the years past. Now, let's look at King and Snohomish County here as well. And I was able to go back using the pending sales report and actually look at last year as well. So I've got week over week and year over year info here to kind of highlight how's the market shifting this past week, but how is it different than last year? Because I think as we're looking at the amount of inventory coming on, and I talked about in my last update that I think we're going to see the summer slow down a little bit earlier this year. And I think we are trending there if we look at some of this data. In King County, though, last week, we saw a median unpublished sales price of $985, which is more than the week before, $933,500. So a little bit higher median price. And as we're looking at average percent over asking price, we were seeing 1% over list price last week, 3% over this week, right? So we're still in the spring market. Things are still moving. There's still competition. In fact, it looks like there was actually more competition this past week than there was the prior week. So 37% were pending with multiple offers versus 34% in the previous week. And we also saw more escalation addendums, 18% versus 14% last week. To compare with last year, 49% of sales in King County in the same week had multiple offers, right? So 12% more last year at the same time, and 29% versus 18% had the escalation addendum. So more competition, more multiple offer scenarios. Same amount over asking price, though, on average, 3% last year versus this year. So we're just seeing a little less of the competition. People aren't necessarily paying more over asking than they were last year at the same time, although prices are up from last year, but there's still less competition. And that continues down with the financing addendums and the inspection addendums when we're looking at King County as well. Last week versus the week before, 59% having the financing addendum, 62% last week, and then 32% with that inspection addendum versus the 35% the previous week. So again, that's about the difference there in multiple offers, 37 versus 34, right? So the people that were being competitive removed those contingencies. It remains about the same percentage there. Last year, though, get this, only 22% in King County had an inspection addendum versus 32% this year in the same week. So we talked about the amount of multiple offer scenarios being higher. It also meant that people were having to be more competitive with their terms last year than they were this year so far at the same time. Either way, it is still more competitive right now than it was last week, but compared to last year, not quite as competitive. And as we look at Snohomish County, right? So we were talking about King County. Now we're looking at Snohomish County. Week over week, we're seeing that the median pending price is also up in Snohomish County, $840,000 versus $788,300 from the previous week. We're seeing the amount over asking price being consistent at 100% of the asking price. So we're pretty much seeing no escalation above asking price on average, right? But we're seeing some selling for more, 3% over last year. So Snohomish County, I think we're going to find, was even more dramatically different than it was last year. I think King County was different. It didn't stand out to me as much as the Snohomish County data here. Week over week, pendings with multiple offers, 30% versus 25%. So we saw an uptick in the multiple offer scenarios in Snohomish County, just like we did in King County. 16% had an escalation addendum versus 15% the previous week, so not too different. If you look back at last year, 51% versus 30% had multiple offers. So 51%, more than half. And 27% versus 16% were pending with an escalation addendum. So I think we saw a higher percentage over asking price last year. I think that was a result of more multiple offer scenarios, more escalation addendums. If we look at the week over week, again, for the contingencies, at least the main couple, financing addendums, the same, 68% this week and last week, and 35% had the inspection addendum, 33% last week. So again, about the same there. The same week last year versus this year, 35% this year, 18% last year. So the large majority of accepted offers last year had no inspection addendum. So as we look at King and Snohomish County in general, we were seeing quite a bit more competition last year than this year. And I think that supports what I've been saying, that we're heading towards potentially an earlier spring market. But at the same time, some of the data this week maybe contradicts that, seeing that maybe we've had an uptick in the multiple offers over the last week in both counties. So we'll see. I'm still hopeful that buyers are going to have more of an opportunity this spring as we head towards the summer market, which typically is a little bit slower here in the Seattle area. I think that we are going to see more inventory. That's going to be the big thing we're going to watch. We're going to see more and more houses coming on the market, and that is going to cause things to slow down because people now can choose from more options. So buyers, if you're out there and you've been missing out, losing out in some multiple offer scenarios, there's hope. I think there's going to be more inventory coming your way. If you haven't gotten started yet, this would be a good time to start having conversations and getting ready to, in my opinion, take advantage of the market slowing down a little bit. And I think for sellers, let's get your house on the market sooner rather than later this year. I think once we hit the fall market like last year and maybe even earlier, we started to see some pretty big price drops to get houses moving. And so I think if you're trying to get the best bang for your buck this year as a seller, you're going to want to list sooner rather than later in 2025. If you have questions, feel free to reach out. And as always, if this video brought you some value, please give it a thumbs up and consider sharing it with others.